Can one of the world's smallest countries give a lesson to the rest of humanity about how to tackle COVID-19? The tiny Faroe Islands have the virus beaten by a combination of testing, tracing and isolating. We asked Sir Harry Burns, the former Chief Medical Officer of Scotland, where technology and following the advice of the World Health Organization can find us a route through the deadly virus. Join us on the Alex Salmond Show, on air and online. Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Stricken, Aberdeenshire, where today we examine whether there's a route through the coronavirus crisis. A pharmaceutical magic bullet still seems some time away. The acute treatments are improving but can do no more than mitigate the impact of this deadly virus. Meanwhile, the world economy is buckling from the draconian measures of social isolation which have resulted in the lockdown of almost a third of humanity. A number of countries, large and small, east and west, have thus far held the virus at bay by following the World Health Organization advice to test, to trace, to isolate. However, for those countries which fell at the first hurdle in March, can technology assist in a new public health initiative and offer a way out of the coronavirus crisis? Can the lockdown be eased with a test, trace, isolate policy now implemented? Today we asked Sir Harry Burns, the Professor of Global Health at the University of Strathclyde, to estimate where we are in finding a route through the crisis. And we look in detail at the tiny Faroe Islands, where thus far they've got the virus beaten. Only 2 active cases remaining and no fatalities. Is there something in their approach which can give a lesson to the larger countries round the world? But first to Glasgow and Tasmania, with your tweets, your emails and your messages.
Thank you, Alex. Last week we discussed the psychological impact of COVID-19, and one of our guests was TV psychologist Emma Kenny, to whom David says, "Emma, well said on the show. You couldn't have summed up the wealth of relationships, working practices and mental health better. I've lived by those words and thoughts always," to which Emma kindly replies, "What a lovely tweet to receive." Pilar says, "Mental health is one of my major concerns during the lockdown. Fear and emptiness are our worst enemies. If we understand that, we are useful and that we're all working together towards the same goal, we will feel much better." Susan says, "The psychological tsunami is not inevitable. Let's use this situation to pivot our collective consciousness, prioritising relationships, play and presence." David MacDonald says, "Isn't there a very realistic possibility that if the world doesn't get back to work soon, that the lockdown is going to end up more damaging than the virus? Not to say that there shouldn't be some lockdown at this time." Louise says, "I worry for those who've lost their partners and are isolating alone and grieving alone." James Burton says, "NHS Scotland are heroes and many, many others out there. Good on them. How lucky we all are to have them all." Hear, hear, James. Last week we also discussed the rising domestic violence figures during this crisis, to which Alison says, "Men are also at risk of domestic violence. Please let's not ignore this. Also, it is the least reported." Laura White says, "I hope all families who have lost loved ones will be getting assistance with funeral costs. No one seems to have mentioned this at all. When people are under financial strain, then they have the worry of additional funeral costs." Louise says, "The economic divide is causing a huge problem."
When the World Health Organization told countries in March to test, some did and some didn't. Those who followed that advice are ahead of the viral curve. Those who didn't now wish they had. I'm now joined from Glasgow by Professor Harry Burns, Professor of Global Health at the University of Strathclyde and Scotland's former Chief Medical Officer. Professor Burns, this week the UK and indeed Scotland have announced a return to the test, trace, isolate strategy. How difficult will that be now that the virus has a substantial grip, even if the peak is past, according to the authorities?
we need to make testing quite a routine thing, and it's far from being a routine. I mean, just to scare you a bit, some of the stories I'm hearing about people with clinical disease that suggest they have COVID, they go to one of these hubs that they're referred to where doctors are wearing all the full PPE and so on. They're told they probably have it. They're sent home to isolate in families where there may be other members of the family and so on that they're mixing with, and they're not tested. It's lunacy. And I'm seeing that, I'm hearing those stories from GPs and from other colleagues, and we just don't seem to have a grip of what we need to do.
How useful will the new app, this smartphone technical device, be in assisting to create an effective tracing and isolation regime?
This app, it's an app that seems to have been in use several weeks ago in other countries, and eventually we're getting to the stage where we're going to be able to use it. And I think it's going to be very important. It's kind of virtual lockdown, if you like, being able to do a number of things like wear masks, know who you're interacting with and so on. It's a way of moving us away from lockdown and still providing some certainty that you will be able to trace and isolate the people who are acquiring the disease. So I think it's important that we all use it.
Now, Professor Burns, you're Professor of Global Health at the University of Strathclyde. Casting your eye internationally, which countries have impressed you with their approach to handling the virus?
Well, there are many. I think South Korea, because of its experience with MERS, was prepared in a way that we clearly have not been prepared. I think Germany moved very rapidly. Discussing, as I did last week with a group of German colleagues, their response, they're taking the view that Germany's getting a bit of undeserved credit. They think Germany could have done more, but they've still kept the death rate down very, very low. Austria, Switzerland, these sort of places have managed this in a way that we clearly have not. And that's a sign that we just have not got to grips with it. Now, Germany started the testing regime very early and were able to manage this much more effectively, I think.
Harry Burns, you're speaking to us from the great city of Glasgow, where it's sometimes been noted that even just a few miles apart, because of economic factors and deprivation, there can be dramatic differences in longevity and life expectancy. Do you suspect that when we come to analyse the impact on mortality and COVID-19, we shall see the same disparities on adjacent populations?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. This will have an impact on health and mortality inequalities, that we will see a reduction in life expectancy in Scotland as a result of this. And the biggest reduction in life expectancy will be at the people at the lower end of the social scale. But that's mathematics that we will have to do as part of the review of activity when this is all done and dusted.
Harry Burns, are there any grounds for optimism that when we emerge from this crisis, that some of the public health messages that have successfully been got across will actually impact in a positive sense in long-term health?
I think the benefits that we will see, funnily enough, will be in the way in which our economy grows. People are looking to local businesses, they're helping them out. The local businesses are doing deliveries and they're starting to keep things going themselves. And I think after this, we will begin to show a bit more care and attention in terms of our own local community action. Inclusive economic growth is a policy that the Scottish Government wants to pursue, growth that includes everyone, affluent and deprived, not just the wealthy who can invest in big international companies and so on, but investing in local people, local enterprise, and keeping the money going in local communities. And I think what we may well see is a more caring society. I certainly hope that's the case.
Looking from the community in Scotland to the global policy, what at this stage can we identify as the great lessons from this global pandemic, and what changes are required at international level so that we are better prepared for the next challenge to come?
From my point of view, the main lesson is listen to the World Health Organization. These are people of immense experience. They get to see what's happening in different parts of the world very early on. And in this instance, they have been much more on the ball than individual countries like the UK, like, God help us, the USA, where things just seem to be spiralling out of control. We have messed about, I think, for too long in the UK, and you can see some impatience within the Scottish Government, because the Scottish Government has jumped in and moved things on a bit faster. The whole of the UK government should have been moving faster earlier. So the lesson is listen to what's happening, look at the technology that other places and systems that other places are using to control it, learn from them and implement as quickly as possible.
And finally, Harry, is there a case, looking at the pressure that's come to bear on the World Health Organization from a variety of sources, of moving their finance into some sort of dependable international basis? For example, a Tobin tax, perhaps, devoting some of the finance for an international tax on financial transactions, or some other means of putting that world specialty into a secure funding. Because if the world is a village in terms of the ability of a virus to communicate, then our World Health Organization should have the security and funding to be able to do the job on behalf of the planet.
Yeah, they need funding. They do not need heads of state withdrawing funding just because they don't like the conclusions they're reaching. They need the funding, but they need the support from the different countries, and that's support in terms of expertise and so on. I worked quite a lot with the World Health Organization when I was Chief Medical Officer in Scotland, and found them to be immensely reliable and capable. And indeed, I'm still in contact with some of them who just cannot believe the way the UK has delayed in getting to grips with this.
Professor Harry Burns from Glasgow, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.
Join us after the break when we find out which country has tested more of its population than any other. The answer might surprise you. Join us then. The UK government in London has announced this week that the Isle of Wight off the south coast of England will be its testing ground, its trial run for the new smart app and mobile phones designed to assist with a renewed testing and tracing policy. But should they be looking north rather than south for inspiration on how to deal with this virus? At the start of this week, the United Kingdom had conducted 16,000 tests for coronavirus per million of its population. Germany had tested twice that number. Of the smaller countries, Norway and New Zealand were on a par with Germany. But all of these countries are left trailing in the wake of the tiny Faroe Islands. With a population of some 50,000, they have tested and traced around 1/5 of the entire country and ruthlessly stamped out the virus. I'm now joined from the Faroes by former Minister Kristina Hafoss, Member of Parliament. Kristina Hafoss, can I take you back to mid-March when the Faroe Islands were confronted with, in terms of your population size, quite a number of cases of coronavirus, some 30 in one day. How did you set about tackling the virus, and get to a situation where now you've got it almost eradicated?
Yes, luckily it seems like the Faroe Islands are among the first nations to be able to stop the virus at the moment. And it all comes back to how we started back in mid-March. Right away, already when we only had 3 cases in the Faroe Islands, we chose to lock down. So we had a very early intervention. I think that has been crucial to the success now later on. We also put in a strategy right away to implement extensive testing and to trace all the cases and to quarantine people who had been in contact with people who were tested positive. And that, of course, this extensive testing showed how many people really had the coronavirus in our society. So people were, in a way, quite shocked in the beginning because as the more we tested, the more we found and the more we learned. In the end, it's turned out to be the right decision to choose this strategy because luckily we succeeded in tracing all cases, in quarantining the relevant people. And at the moment, we only have like 2 active cases and 99% of the 187 people who were tested positive have recovered. So right now, things are going good, but we know that can change.
Now, Kristina, you've arrived at a situation where you've tested in the Faroe Islands almost 20% of your population. How does a small island group arrive at having the facilities to enable you to carry out such an exercise?
The reason that we have such a relatively huge testing capacity is actually found in our salmon industry. Already 20 years ago, we had this huge virus outbreak in the salmon industry. And back then, we chose to invest in advanced laboratory facilities. And since then, each year, we perform thousands of virus tests in our salmon to ensure that the salmon is healthy. So back in January, when we heard about all this virus in China, a researcher at our laboratory recommended to the health authorities here in the Faroe Islands that we adapted the laboratory to make tests of viruses in people. So when we got our first case, 3rd of March, and started to test extensively, we were ready. We got the results within a few hours, and that has made it possible to stop the spread of the virus.
Now, with your success in reducing the number of new cases to virtually 0, and with only 2 live cases of COVID-19 still under supervision, have you been able in the Faroe Islands to relax the economic lockdown?
Yes, luckily we have been successful in stopping the virus. We had 187 cases and 185 of them have recovered, so only 2 active cases at the moment. We only had 3 new cases the last 4 weeks, and all of those 3 cases were people who came from abroad, and they were already in 2 weeks quarantine, so it hasn't spread since then. And that's why we are very strict on demanding that people who come to the Faroe Islands go into 2 weeks quarantine, because in that way we can ensure that the virus won't spread again. So yes, we have been able to ease the restrictions, and the kids have gone back to school. Daycare has opened. People are beginning to go back to work. So the only restrictions we have still is that you can't gather more than 50 people at one place, and you should still try to be 2 meters apart.
And I understand, Kristina, that yourself and your fellow MPs have offered to lend expertise to the Western Islands of Scotland, your neighbours, your nearest neighbours almost, over the Atlantic.
I know there have been connections between the Scottish government and the Faroese government, and I just hope that they will also give some positive results, because I think it's very important if we could help each other through this very difficult times.
And is there an awareness in the Faroe Islands, along with a number of countries, but a fairly select band like New Zealand and Taiwan, that the Faroe Islands have been one of the best cases thus far in the world of demonstrating how to confront and tackle and suppress such a deadly virus?
The things that we have in common is that we have all chosen this early intervention, that we went very early in with lockdown. In the Faroe Islands, we only had 3 positive cases when we locked down. Secondly, that we have traced all the cases, found the people who have been in contact with people who have tested positive, and that we have put people into quarantine. That has made it possible for us to reopen our society much faster, and hopefully also, you can say, the long-term damage, both economically, but also in other ways, because it's not healthy for people to be in lockdown too long.
Kristina Hafoss in the Faroe Islands, thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and well done on your strategy thus far.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, and wish you all the best and stay safe.
The UK government is piloting its tracing app on the Isle of Wight, but in h-Eileanan, the local Member of Parliament, Angus MacNeil, says the Scottish government should be piloting its tracing policy on the Hebrides. I'm now joined from the beautiful island of Barra by Angus MacNeil. Welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show, Angus.
A great pleasure, Alex. Thank you.
Now, you've heard from Kristina Hafoss from the Faroe Islands about the systems that they've employed in these islands. Is that the sort of thing you want to see in the Western Isles?
Absolutely. The Faroe system has been remarkably successful when you consider the amount of testing they've done, the cases they've found, and the way they've limited those cases. Even more so this weekend when we find out in my neighbouring island of Skye, there are 54 cases of COVID-19 proven positive there. That is more than a third of what the Faroese have found, or about a third of what the Faroese have found. And it's absolutely astonishing that one island can have that. But of course, when we're following the flawed UK system of just cross your fingers, hope for the best as we're all in lockdown, magically waiting for the virus to go away, that will happen.
So this serious outbreak in a nursing home in Portree in the island of Skye, is that an emphasis for you, if it were needed, that island communities are in no senses immune from the spread of this virus?
Absolutely, and the only thing that can limit the virus, as I think the Faroe Islands and Iceland have shown, is proper policies and aggressively chasing the virus. That's why I've called for a pilot in my constituency in the Outer Hebrides to ape basically what the Faroe Islands have done and what Iceland have done, and that is when we find somebody positive, we go and look for all their contacts, test them, quarantine them, and make sure the virus is not going any further. To sit back as we're doing and waiting for the virus to come knocking at the door means you will find pockets of 54 cases all at once.
Now, in the last week, the UK government in London have announced a pilot scheme in the Isle of Wight, just off the south coast of England, for their new intelligent phone app to assist with tracing. Is this what you mean for Scotland, or are you thinking of something more encompassing?
I wish them well in the Isle of Wight with their trial, and I think they're fortunate to be one of the best areas, one of the areas of England, one of the best areas of England to test the app. But I think when all said and done, the app will only take you so far. We need something bigger and better, and the bigger and better thing is to test, to trace, to track where the virus is, exactly what the Faroe Islands have done. And they've even been kind enough to offer us in the Hebrides assistance, both from government level and from private company level, to ensure we have the capacity to achieve this test, trace and track of the virus. And I think that's something that we should be grateful to them for.
Now, we've heard from the Faroe Islands that they adapted their testing regime for salmon farming to find salmon viruses and used that rather cleverly in an innovative fashion to give them the testing facility required to track down COVID-19. Is this what you've got in mind for the Western Islands, or are you going to use one of the Army mobile units like the one that's been sent to Skye?
Whatever comes, we need to increase the capacity. I mean, we should firstly be congratulating the Faroese on their ingenuity and their self-starting. They haven't sat back and wait for somebody else to come and do things. I have a health board that's sitting back at the moment and, quote, awaiting guidance presumably from the central government policy to change in Edinburgh. So what is there is the technical and the hardware to do the testing. What isn't there it's the political lifting of the pen to change the policy that will enable them to do so, or indeed even the demand from the Health Board to achieve that as well. So this is where the logjam is, as far as I can see, within Scotland and within the wider UK. I think we need more autonomy.
But surely the Scottish Government has indicated that they are moving back to a test, trace and isolate policy. Can't the Hebrides just wait for that to be rolled out over Scotland? Why do we need a pilot scheme in the Hebrides?
Well, it's written that man can tether neither time nor tide, and don't think that man can tether the movement of a virus either. We have to be lightning quick, and to be indicating we might do something at some point within a week or two's time really isn't good enough when we have the capability to do it now. So I think things need to be a bit quicker. We can't tether the movement of this virus, as the outbreak in Skye shows. 54 people on our doorstep are positive all of a sudden. This could have been us, perhaps, in just a slight change of circumstances.
They're actually quoting from Scotland's national poet Robert Burns, but shouldn't you be giving us pearls of wisdom from some Gaelic seer from Barra?
Well, I think you're getting the pearls of wisdom at the moment in this interview, and I hope that actually, they're not really my pearls of wisdom. I mean, they are the pearls of wisdom of the World Health Organization. When I spoke to the Faroese health minister, the situation, I asked him, what did you do? He said, quite simply, we just followed the World Health Organization guidelines. It's not very difficult. You just do that, and you do it well. And that's what they've done, and that's why they have tamed, at this moment in time, coronavirus. Indeed, Iceland and New Zealand and many other jurisdictions have done that as well, simply by following the good advice that was given, not trying to reinvent the wheel, which is what happened in the UK post-March the 12th.
Angus MacNeil from the wonderful island of Barra, thank you very much for joining us today.
Very welcome, thank you.
There are many things about coronavirus we do not yet fully understand. However, some things we do know. We know that this virus attacks the elderly first and foremost. We know that people of colour are vulnerable. We know that it's highly infectious. We also know that those countries which followed the World Health Organization advice to test, to trace, to isolate are ahead of the virus curve. Those who didn't are still locked in its deadly embrace. Now, when New Zealand and Iceland are cited as countries which have handled this virus well, people say, but they're small countries and they're islands. But Taiwan is not a small country, and Germany is neither an island nor a small country. In any case, small countries have by definition the resources of small countries. Where they have been successful is because they've followed international best practice and adapted the resources they've had to meet the challenge. In the Faroe Islands, as we have heard, they've used the laboratories they've had for testing for salmon viruses to come to the help and aid of their human population. The larger question, the much larger question, is whether those countries which failed in March to implement tracing and testing, can they now reintroduce it as a means of escaping from the ruinous economic lockdown, and can this be done without letting the virus loose once again? Of one thing we can be absolutely sure: technical apps through smartphones may provide a useful addition to a policy, but in themselves they are no substitute for boots on the ground, or at least personnel manning the phone banks and implementing a proper policy of testing, tracing and isolating. And so from Tasmina and myself and all at the show, it's stay safe, goodbye for now, and we'll see you next week.